Good evening. Welcome to the BS and Beer Show. Of course, BS stands for Building Science. Tonight's topic is advancements in framing. I'm Travis Brungart, also probably Steve Baczek's favorite, although others might choose to disagree. And I'm in Kansas City drinking a lot of water. I've been under the weather this week, so I am going to be just fine, though. Nothing serious, just stomach. Anyway, BS and Beer is an independent grassroots movement to share building science knowledge through local meetup groups and this, our Zoom show. The Brew Crew and our guests volunteer our time each week to bring you what we hope is a fun and informative discussion. I would like to take this moment to thank Green Building Advisor and Fine Home Building Magazine, our media partners, and of course, to thank you, our audience members. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'll turn it over to Emily for announcements.
Hey guys, announcements tonight. I am also drinking water. I'm not under the weather, but I had my first shot today. This seemed like a better plan. So drinking that. So you can find the chat box on the bottom of the screen. It's probably already flashing. We encourage everybody who's in the audience to tell us you're here, introduce what you're drinking, let all your friends know you're here, because otherwise only the panelists know you're here. So introduce yourself and ask questions in the chat box. If we don't get to your questions during the show, please continue it on the Green Building Advisor blog about the show afterwards. We encourage our guests and panelists to continue the conversation there because as you'll see tonight, we don't get all the way through all the comments that end up in the chat box. So Fine Home Building sends out a reminder every week. That's simply a link to get on the show and a reminder that it's coming up. If you want to know what the show is going to be about, get on our mailing list over at thebsandbeershow.com, and that'll give you a reminder. And it'll also link you to the blog post that Kylie puts up every week, which has the replay of the previous week's show. This week's show will be up tomorrow evening or Saturday on Green Building Advisor and on YouTube. And you can also find the show anywhere that podcast players are, if audio only is the way you like it. It's not as good as watching the show, but if that's how you take your content, it is available on that. I'm going to post a bunch of links in the chat box about Skills USA BS Fridays with Mark, who's joining us tonight. So if you haven't seen his BS Fridays, check that out. Passive House Accelerator, my podcast, the Unbuild It podcast. And I want to mention we picked our next book for book club. So this is up on the website. If you haven't chosen, sorry, my background screen never likes me. Musings of an Energy Nerd by none other than our buddy Martin. So if you guys want to read the book, please go ahead and follow the links on the bsandbeershow.com's website to pick up the book, and we'll review that roughly in 3 months or so. So
I have a few updates to add to that.
Okay.
I talked to Martin today. I'm Kylie Jacques. I'm the senior editor. I'm just jumping in here because that's what I usually say, Emily, and you did such a beautiful job with it. And I know Travis can be. So anyway, I'll just add this much. I'm drinking, Gerolsteiner mineral water, which I'm in good company tonight, it sounds like. I talked to Martin today, and July 8th is the day that the episode that we'll be talking about the book, and I've got my fingers crossed that he's gonna come on. He hemmed and hawed a little bit, but I think I can get him, so that will be fun. What was the other thing? I guess that was it. The date and Martin's tentative yes. So that's all I have to say. Travis is gonna do introductions, right?
Back to Ben. Actually, I set Ben up for failure by not giving him the proper documents.
Oh, that's right. You did the regular intro.
Punted and ready to go. Right. Thank you, Ben.
Right.
And I haven't had any creative writing time to do intros for these guys like I did last week. So this evening I'm drinking Danny Boy Pilsner from my local Kent Falls Brewing, who I'm a huge fan of. Our guests tonight, we'll start with Mr. Engel, the senior in attendance. Andy has been in the trade since September of 1979, an oddly specific timeline there, when he gravely disappointed his mother and didn't attend Drew University. Those years included stints as a trim carpenter, a stair builder, a spec builder, and an editor at Fine Home Building and Professional Deck Builder magazines, and as a manager with the JLC Live and the Remodeling Show. Currently, he works as a remodeling carpenter in Roxbury, Connecticut, and as a freelance writer, editor, and blogger for Fine Home Building and Green Building Advisor. And he's also husband to one of the best cooks that I've ever had the pleasure to meet.
Damn straight.
That's nice.
Alexandra Baczek is an associate at Stephen Baczek Architects in New England. She's a graduate with a Master's of Architecture from Roger Williams University in Rhode Island. Currently, she works on custom residential projects that exhibit high levels of energy efficiency, durability, health, comfort, and environmental responsibility. She has recently started contributing to Green Building Advisor's Energy Smart Details blog. And then Mr. Mark Wille, is that correct? It's Willie?
You got it, brother.
Is the Director of Building Experience for U.S. Engineered Wood Tstuds. He is the remaining founder of Build Smart Chicago, which has evolved into an offsite ministry of education focused on Passive House and the building science consulting teams. Mark serves on a number of boards, including Carbon Free 2050, Passive House Alliance, Illinois Green Alliance, Tiny House Alliance USA, Habitat for Humanity Construction Committee, IGA Greenbuilt Home Tour, Legacy Committee of Greenbuild 2018, and Rebuilding Exchange. He is active in the building science community and has retrofitted several residences of varying certifications. His free time is shared with Passive House Accelerator, Building Science, #BS Friday Live, and Tstud Radio. Pleasure to have you all.
Did we miss anything in the introductions? A lot of times we'll give you guys an opportunity to share the missing tidbits, you know, the fun fact.
Well, at the very least, they should tell us what they're drinking, right?
That seems reasonable. You want to start, Andy?
Sure. Well, I'm drinking a Baltimore Blonde by Guinness, largely because my wife likes it and it's what was in the fridge. So
those are two very good reasons to drink
Indeed.
most anything.
Yeah.
What do you got, Mark?
This is well water spiked with flower roots. So still early in my day, so enjoying well water. And you asked if we missed anything, so I guess I'll start at the beginning. Back in the early 70s was a small town in Harvey, Illinois. I was conceived, and do you want me to go through every year?
So we can just start right there. Can you give us some details about the conception?
I was several weeks early. I was much more smiley and handsome at that stage. Yeah, and my dad was off buying a train set, Ben, because in those days you had to make use of your time, and so that's what he did.
Fantastic. How about you, Lexi? You, I think, are not getting a fair shake here.
I think I'm keeping up with the trend. I'm drinking water tonight. No drinking on the job, per se, Stephen Bazek rules.
Nice.
So we're drinking water tonight. But no, I think you guys really have it pretty much under control. Roger Williams just graduated. It's almost been a year. It's been a really fun year. I think Mark's been with me for that journey for pretty much all of it.
Yeah.
We've been going since like month out, maybe something like that. But it's a lot of fun. I'm having a great time.
I'll just chime in here and say that, Alexandra, do you prefer Lexi? I need to know this.
I go back and forth, but Lexi's perfectly fine.
Okay. Has been doing a wonderful job at contributing to GBA. We're so excited to have her. Is really having a younger voice, somebody's fresh out of school. You know, her drawings are excellent, and the information she shares is just top notch. So we're just thrilled. So.
It's a lot of fun. It makes me, every single month I have to pick something that I know, but I don't really know that well. And I probably take like a number of like 5 hours to sit there and really figure it out. Make a couple calls to Mark and back and forth. And we talk about a few things, and there we go. There's the next detail coming out.
Good.
She balances out the dreck that Andy and I spew in our blogs rather nicely.
Perfect.
Well, speaking of those counterpoints of Lexi being, you know, on the cutting edge, and then going back through the rest of us, maybe even back to the perspective of the former Fine Home Building editor, Andy, I thought we might start off this show with kind of a look back to see the advancements through the progression of framing is what I would really consider it. You know, the caveman started with just the hole, and he really stepped it up with a log home and then timber frame, and from there we kind of moved to balloon framing, and I think that was kind of around the time that you had a thing or two to say about that. Am I right, Andy?
Are you saying I was around at that point?
I'm saying that you would have the best perspective
Sure.
As opposed to Lexi on that.
I see a lot of balloon frames. Actually, I see more timber frames where I work. Most of the houses that I work on date from either the 18th century or the early 19th century. So we do see a lot of a lot of timber frames. Balloon frames came in later in the 19th century. Studs reaching from the foundation all the way up to the top plate. They're really wonderful for promoting the stack effect because there's no blocking in those walls whatsoever. Timber frames are actually better because they have plates at every level, so you have some at least some air stopping there. But they all lack sheathing, and it wasn't until later in the 19th century you started seeing buildings with sheathing. They would nail the studs or the siding directly to the frame of the building, and it all worked because there was no air sealing, and any heat that there was leaked out. There was tons of air leakage, and it kept the framing dry. Where things leaked, they had an opportunity to dry. And it is also true that wood was better then. You had old growth wood, tighter growth rings, more heartwood. Heartwood of any species is more rot resistant than the sapwood of that particular species. And just compare the number of growth rings in a 200-year-old framing member to one you pick up at the lumberyard today, if you can afford to do that. And the new stuff is just pulpwood. It rots so quickly if it gets wet. So yeah, when we are remodeling, one of the key things that I think about once we've stripped back to the siding from the inside is how are we going to insulate this in a way that isn't going to destroy the house, because you've taken the system that has worked for 200 years and destroyed it. And there are a number of ways, a number of approaches, and I think a lot of it is still experimental. But I also do think it's one particular spot where rigid foam in particular can be your friend. You can use that as an infill, either directly against the back of the siding, or add a couple of wood strips, and you can create a sort of a rain screen, an ersatz rain screen. Doesn't necessarily do much for drainage, but at least it gets you an airspace in there and provides some opportunity to dry. And then on the inside of that foam, you can use whatever more environmentally responsible insulation you care to go with. You can blow in cellulose, you can use mineral wool. You have options then, but preserving the house is the first do no harm, right?
Andy, you forgot to mention one of the joys of working in balloon frames is if you're working in the attic and you drop a tool, you can just go down into the basement and get it out of the basement.
Yeah. Well, I know guys too who have rented a cellulose blower with the idea of insulating the walls in a balloon frame house, and they start up in the attic and they just blow and they blow and they blow. They don't realize that those stud bays are wide open to the attic. There's no blocking at the bottom of them, and that cellulose just flows right out into the basement. You can put a lot of cellulose into the basement if you don't think about that first step of getting in there and blocking off the bottom of those bays.
I don't know if you've seen it much. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
I've worked with many balloon frame buildings in Chicago. So our two flats, all the lots are the same. They're 25 by 125. They're all east-west oriented buildings. And just like you said, they're true 2x4s. They were fir. They're put up in 1890 to 1915. And being two flats, they're typically 9 foot on both ceilings. So you're looking at some 24-foot studs, straight as can be. And then what I find interesting in many of the houses we've redone is they had the 1x sheathing, right? So all type of grades, all type of widths, and those were slapped into the 2x4s. And then in terms of dryness, they're incredibly dry because so many of these homes had the asphalt shingles as the siding, right? So these walls are so solid, and then many times, of course, you find the plaster lath on those exterior walls, which is a whole nother level of fiber added to it. And those 2x4s today are mint condition. I could
Mhm.
tell you I built hundreds of tables from the stud walls we've taken out.
Yeah.
Beautiful specimens.
That's true.
What I was going to get at before is I'm not sure if Andy's seen, but around here, Andy and I work in the same area essentially. I often see timber frames where the interior partition walls were just slabs of the tree that they cut. They didn't even bother to edge the edges of them because they didn't need the time, and they just nail them up to the summer beams of the bents of the frame, and that's how they created the partitions. And it was
Yeah. And they'd run accordion lath on that. Have you seen accordion lath?
No, I don't think so.
So that's where they take a, half-inch thick board and split it part way from the right, then split it part way from the left, and stretch it out like an accordion. It's really cool. Usually it's in relatively short lengths, 2-foot lengths. But I saw that first on Roe Osborne's house in Woodbury, Connecticut, and that was nailed perpendicular to the board on an interior partition, like you just said.
What's the benefit of that, Andy? I don't understand.
Well, think back to how difficult it was to saw wood in the 18th century. It's much easier to split wood than it is to saw it when you're talking about thin dimensions in particular. But go up to Old Sturbridge Village sometime and watch them run that water-powered vertical sawmill that they have. That, I don't know how those people didn't die of boredom watching that those boards go through there.
Better than being on the pit saw.
That's true. It's a big advancement over that.
We did a
Sounds
house
like a
from,
road trip.
the
There we go.
1690s with the accordion lath, and the insulation was actually corn cob that was stuffed in there.
Huh,
Yeah.
I love that.
Or marsh grass was a common one in coastal areas up here, that just to harvest the marsh grass from, the salt flats and pack it into the stud bays.
Yep.
That's wild. So the innovations that we've seen from just moving from the cave to our accordion lathe are impressive, but then we kind of start taking some giant leaps forward. Well, not necessarily. I guess we introduce different things and new problems to solve with some of our advancements. Then certainly some of the things that I always found interesting when I ran into older remodels was the solutions for not having large members. They would do these little split headers where you have kind of a built-in truss over your doors and things like that. But then with I guess you'd say the lack of availability of the longer members, isn't that probably what brought platform framing along, where it was a matter of we can't get the longer members, or we're trying to do pre-cuts from the mill to help the framers go faster. But basically we moved from a balloon frame where the studs went from sill to ridge and broke it up into floors. And I know that was a lot driven by speed, but if you guys want to infill some accurate information here, I can BS all day.
I don't know the answer to that, except that I know, framing a balloon frame wall like you have to occasionally do for a big gable end wall, something like that, where you need a continuous load path to resist the wind loads, is a pain in the neck. It is not easy to raise a 20-something foot tall wall. So I suspect it had as much to do with efficiency as it did with anything else. And also, how difficult would it have been to get a load of 24-foot long studs through the city streets on a horse-drawn delivery wagon? It was a lot easier.
I think that's where it happened, was in our commodity shift, where we were transporting such large sums that we reduced it to unit sizes that were capable of being moved. Along the same lines, it's when we realized it's easier to stand a 9-foot or 10-foot wall than worry about that 24-inch stud in the wind, or 24-foot stud in the wind.
Yeah.
That's a big deal, safety factor and all.
Yeah.
It's an interesting synergy of that timing, but I'll bet it was a culmination.
Well, sheet goods kind of came along with that, is my understanding, that basically it made sense if you were going to stand 8 and 9-foot walls and you could get sheet goods in that material, you could actually sheathe efficiently. And then you could really stand up some heavy walls. If that tall gable wall wasn't heavy enough for you, now we can put windows in it and siding on it too. So all of that stuff came along essentially as an advancement, and then engineered lumber shortly thereafter. And that's where we get into the, the LVLs and the timber strand, the I-joist products, all that stuff. kind of was the next step, but that's kind of still where a lot of the market that I'm in is at. We're not using a lot of CLT yet. We're not seeing a lot of SIPs products, but those are the next, like that's the newfangled fancy stuff here in the Midwest. Like, ooh, that's a SIPs house, crazy. But that's kind of where we wanted to go with this. Like we've understood the progression and the why, but as we're moving forward, knowing what we know now about physics and building science and the drying potential that Andy was getting at earlier, we have, energy problems to solve, structural problems to solve. And so we keep seeing different approaches to that. And I feel like that's where I was excited to have Lexi on, because I haven't been studying anything recently other than what comes across on GBA, or, you can only fit so many articles into each month's Fine Home Building. So I was hoping that we would get a little bit of a fresh perspective on the things that I probably don't even know about yet, because I'm always behind the curve. What are we missing? What's coming down the pike? What's the next thing?
So it's funny, like balloon framing was definitely explained to us in school. Like it was something that was it's not to be repeated. It's done. It's old. We don't use it anymore. And it was all about platform framing because it was all about efficiency, which is exactly what you guys have been talking about, of that idea of we've gotten, and it's funny, a lot of it in school, they talked about how people combine what they do every single day with what, like their lifestyle choices with what we're doing. So for example, we've turned into this much faster paced world where everything we can get with a click of a button, everything that we can move much faster on. And that being so is translated into what we are seeing now in our everyday jobs, because that mindset carries over to what you're doing during work. So our mindsets are now sitting there saying like, oh, how can we do this faster? How can we get this quicker? And you're seeing all of these things come about. And that was a big topic in school, to sit there and talk about like, okay, a lot of this drive is coming from the fact that we don't want to spend all of this time figuring that out. We'd rather, if we can figure out the first story, it's likely the second story is going to be similar. So rather than figuring out a big puzzle, it's more about figuring out one and adapting it to the second one.
That makes sense. I wondered how much of that we get into. Obviously, the layout of the house has a lot more options when you no longer have to have the 20-foot tall stud at the gable ends. You can get a more complicated floor plan and break things up with different load paths in the interior of the house, and then do more complicated roof lines with the large spanning LVLs and things like that. Is there go ahead.
Have that like post-war era ranch that came about too, which was made as a big point of the fact that we stopped concentrating on these massive estates and turned towards these ranch platforms. And that also drove a reason for the fact that we started seeing the platform framing and all of that stuff come about as well.
Makes sense.
So that brought up a huge part of it.
I think that was an interesting point you made too, Travis, about the arrival of the glue lamps and the laminated timber, because so for those of you that have framed for a long time, you're used to these giant 3x, exceptionally long hemlock and Doug fir, and there's something else. But these plants came along and they were using, what would essentially be turned into a smaller stick, and we're capable of creating these longer ridge beams for our assemblies. It was remarkable, and the adaptation of those beams over time to be that once the glues got proven out, I should say, we added so much to it, and the strength ratio was just it was welcomed. So you had this piece, you put it up, and you had accessibility to now meet the curve of the escalation of homes that was being produced, because that's a lot faster to do that than the milling process of the other ones. So it's good use of materials. It's wonderful use of structural engineering science, and our industry really is blessed by it. We're still seeing the manifestations of that today in the numerous types of mass timber that's coming around us.
With that growth of, the laminated timbers and all of the associated products is we get a level of repeatability, not only of repeatability of quality, but of repeatability of safety. If we're not having to rely on an organic material that may have defects that are missed by a grader, we have, a homogeneous product with a known load rating that we can rely on to achieve, what we're trying to do with our buildings.
Something interesting about it's sort of a time juxtaposition with laminated lumber and very old houses. There's no standard framing sizes in old houses, and when you're trying to fit new stuff in, sometimes you have to rip material to width. You do that with solid sawn lumber, and you lose its grade stamp. Lumber is graded to be the width, the depth that it is. You take a 2x12 and rip it into two 2x6s. It doesn't meet code technically because of the location of the knots and so on next to the ripped edge. But you can do that with laminated lumber all day long. The strength factor is more linear across the depth, and it really can come in handy in 200-year-old houses.
You're exactly right. I don't think people are aware of the grading process, and you could trim the length of your lumber, but you can't even adjust the corners of the width. And the laminated lumber, gosh, I remember the lumber yards, you would just ask for the length you needed, and they had the longest pieces that they could get, and they cut and they sent that out, and they cut and they sent that out. And I believe we're going to see that with some of these different mass timber pieces where you're getting large portions, and local places will be cutting it and doling it out. Could be pretty exciting. You can tell what I love because that brings it out of me.
Mark, your enthusiasm is always palpable. I did see something in the chat about SIPs, which we haven't mentioned yet. And I think that's something that is worth talking about because these systems get really complicated, especially when you're someone like Andy or Ben or myself that's taking them apart and modifying them after the fact. That's one of the nice things about the timber frame. Like Andy mentioned, usually there's infill. You don't mess with the structure, you're okay. The way that we worked that through balloon, pretty basic too. Platform, you can do some engineering. What about modifying SIPs? This is a structurally insulated panel. It's basically an OSB sandwich with EPS foam in the middle, and all the strength of it comes from the glued laminated connection from the foam to the OSB. I've never worked with SIPs myself, but I do have a few friends in the market that have, and they generally have just said, yeah, you don't remodel SIPs, which seems like good advice, but almost all my clients are remodel clients, so I don't know what to do about these things.
And you hope you don't have a water leak in a SIP's house.
Oh, yeah. How do you fix that? We looked at a job last year where it was a SIP's construction. The siding had leaked and the OSB on the outside had rotted. What do you do?
I haven't worked on one firsthand, but Andy, you and I actually have a mutual friend that I know that worked on one, and he couldn't get an engineer. He went through half a dozen locally, and none of them would touch it.
Yeah.
Because there's really very little they can do without taking it out and essentially reframing, stick frame in that area. And even they don't want to write off on that because it changes the whole dynamics of the whole, wall plane at that point if you replace a section with stick frame.
Yeah. I can't speak to it. I know some of the SIPs are different. Remodeling a SIP project would be arduous for exactly what you said, Ben, is how do you get someone to sign off at the new connection points? Because it's not meant to be done that way. It's meant to be unibody. There are instances where you have to make a correction for your window, right? And so you do have to carve out and add in your King Jack header to make that adjustment. That's possible. But yet I've also been on a SIP project where they came in full form with no window openings, and it's a 12-inch SIP. What do? You break out your chainsaw and you create an opening. So there's some slick benefits, and then there's some hesitancy if it goes sideways of how to correct. You have to be a surgeon.
Mark, Ben, maybe you know the answer to this one. A lot of the use that I see of SIPs is essentially just to skin new timber frames. I don't think that they're structural in themselves. I
They're
think the
not.
timber frame is giving you the structure.
Well,
So
they can be structural in
well, they're
themselves.
certainly help with the lateral loads, but if you do your angle bracing correctly, that system's worked for a long time.
So my understanding, SIPs is they can be structural on their own without any secondary
Yeah.
structure, so to speak, but it's all comes down to the splining that joins the panels. And for me, my pushback on that is essentially the attractiveness of SIPs is that it's essentially thermal bridge free.
Mhm.
But when we start relying on them to perform the structure of the building and we have to insert these splines into there, we've now essentially added the same amount of lumber in that spline area as is in the whole 4-foot width of a typical framed wall. So you have no real energy benefit and you have a cost increase. You get a speed of installation, which is great and can be helpful, but I have mixed feelings about SIPs. I think, like Andy mentioned, in the application of putting them over an additional frame or using them over top of an existing structure, they can work really well. I'm not personally sold on them as their own structure.
I would add to that, Ben, that some SIP providers are different than others. So one-stop shop is not true. They're not all the same. So some might have that thermal break figured out, and some might just be an SIP. So it's insulated, but that doesn't mean it has a thermal break.
My impression has always been that architects are way more excited about SIPs than builders are. Do you think that's true?
So I think builders are often, we like the Lego mentality of putting things together. Having it already put together takes a little bit of the joy out of it, right? Because you enjoy that part of the craft. And then the fun part is we would love to show up on job sites where the foundation is dead nuts, right? It's perfect, but it's not. And so making that a change in the field as you're working on your bottom plate and as you're bringing the stem wall up is fine, but doing that with the SIP and a team is a little bit more arduous. So the responsibility lies in the cohesiveness of that foundation, and sometimes you just don't get what you want, and you're used to doing that on the fly because at the end of the day you got to finish those walls, right? And the walls got to be right, and it's just more work on the SIP. I think that would be my comment.
You know, one of my former business partners, when I was spec building in Jersey, used to say, all change is bad. And I think that's a pretty common attitude in builders. And there's really some truth in it. Maybe I'm, revealing too much about my own prejudices about stuff. But as a matter of practicality, how do you get your run-of-the-mill builder who isn't sitting here tonight and excited about new things to embrace new approaches?
It's a great question. I've often said that in many times, those in the building industry, we got a profession because someone we knew had an opening and they said, come give this a try. So we were loaned the tools, and sometimes that was a broom, right? And we worked our way through it.
Broom and a shovel.
But oftentimes, once we were wearing our rigs, right, and we got all our gear together and we were doing our job, we did that job because we had to finish that job that day, and we tried to learn from the person on the crew that was better, right? However, very seldom were we ever encouraged to build a better wall. We were encouraged to finish a wall.
Yes.
That was our thing. And to add the siding and add the window, whatever trade you picked up along the way so that you weren't the one sitting, that's what you picked up. But the encouragement really wasn't there. And there certainly wasn't the plethora of materials, trainings or sharing that exists today. I mean, it is all around us. So it's a different playing field. It's
No,
just
I
like,
agree.
I'm surprised there's not a line around the corner of people saying, I want to build.
No, and I think a lot of that, Mark, is exactly a conversation that me and you had earlier about collaboration and about how much easier it is to talk. I think when you have more people on board and more people to figure out a problem, it's a lot easier to attack a problem. So when you say people just want to finish the wall and they don't want to build better, it's a lot easier to build better when you have 6 people sitting there focused on, okay, how do we do it? If you give me, that's like my dad handing me something I'm not quite sure about. It's a lot easier if I have 4 of me looking at it in different perspectives to sit here and make it a better wall rather than just one person looking at it. And me and you talked earlier, the collective error will always be significantly less than the individual error, always. When you have more people looking about it, you have more people distinguishing different problems. For example, let's take the T-stud that we all talk about. You have the T-stud, and when you have a designer using it, when you have a builder using it, and the manufacturer using it, you bring about the ways that you envisioned using it. Now I have my ways of how I think it would look better and it would go together better. And then you have somebody like Jake who uses the Missouri house coming and saying, well, wait, how do I attach this? I think this would make it an easier corner to attach the drywall or to attach this or to cut out that. So when you have all those people looking about it, it's a lot easier to make the right decision and the better decision.
In that vein, Lexi, I had a conversation just last week with a panelization company, an offsite company, that they actually aren't the company that makes the panels, but what they are is they are the intermediary between the builder and architect and the panel company. And what they're doing is they're taking the design from the architect and fully remodeling it, and they're acting as another set of eyes essentially on the project. They're prepping it for the panelization company to be able to actually make it, but they're also taking like all the MEP drawings and everything and fully mapping everything out. So we're looking and we're finding clash detections where that duct is supposed to run through that steel I-beam and all of that up front. And it's doing exactly like you're saying, it's just putting another set of eyes on the whole process so that you can, streamline and integrate and catch that much more when it's in a computer instead of standing around with guys scratching their asses on a job site.
Well, no, and I think everybody wins out of it because I get help because that way I don't have to spend the 3 hours of drawing it to find out that the builder doesn't like it all of a sudden. It's not going to work that way to go back to redo these drawings. If I have him on board, we figure that all out the first round. It's a win for the T-stud people because if we realize that something isn't working how we would like it to and we want to work it this way, then if they change it and it really works better, more sales, more people like it, the better it works. I mean, everybody's winning in the situation. And we also talked about everybody sits there and says, let's think outside the box to come up with a new solution for whatever problem we're looking at. The only way I can think outside of the box is to sit there and really understand what we're looking, what's the box, what's all of the problems that we have in the box. Because if I don't understand every aspect of the issue, I can't think outside of it because I don't really have every opinion coming at me to understand where do I need to go and where's everybody's goals at.
That's a culmination of what Andy said and what you said just there, Alexandra, that always rings through for me. It's something new comes along and you need to bring it to a crew, whether the architect drew it or whether it's necessary for the project it came to be. And the change is met with skepticism because it's new. And afterwards, because of the collaboration point that Alexandra brings forward, that brings people to give it a try because they saw someone else do it, they adopt it, and moving forward, they become the evangelists. And they start saying, well, they always love to be the first, right? I was the first person to do this.
Yeah.
And now the thing is, in this wonderful world of building science, I was the first person in this town to do this, right? So now we make it as a regional impression, and I guarantee you, the builder teams down the road that are looking at your work, they're gonna watch the collaboration and the evangelists on your job, and they're gonna learn from it, and they're gonna try to take your spot because it's a competitive market.
Yeah, and one of the best parts is the minute you open those doors don't shut. So the minute I realize I can give you a call and have my question answered, when I run down a problem down the line, I'm not nervous to call you again. I'm not like that door's open and I'm ready to go. So when I have an issue, I ask my dad. 5 times out of 10, I get the right answer. No, more like 9 times out of 10 sometimes. But then if I call Jake and Peter after that, between the 3 of them, it's like now I'm very confident that whoever comes at me with the next question, I'm fully prepared to answer just about 90% after I've asked the 3 of them.
Wouldn't it take about 6 days to get full answers from Stephen, Jake, and Peter? Wouldn't that
I
take?
think I get fired once a day by my dad by how many questions.
How does
I think
everybody
you need a
here?
t-shirt company.
How does
Yeah.
everybody here feel about offsite construction? Do we really think that this is an advancement for the industry? For as long as I've been in the business, I've been hearing that it's coming right around the corner. And it seems like it's still being said. What does everybody think about that idea?
I think there are so many pros to it, but I also think that people are pushing the idea, let's say, too far. I think that there are places for it, and I think that it's a great idea for it to go ahead and start that. If we can have components of a wall that are just out there, and you imagine how much easier it would be for the builder to start putting up these pieces with the insulation, the drywall, the plywood, and everything, and it's just getting knitted together. But I also think that some of the ways that they're pushing it, I think part of the reason it's taking too long is because they're trying to do it as one massive effort, and let's start with just components of it and see how far it takes off.
Such as what
great.
components? Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Andy.
I was just going to say, I was going to make a flip comment. I think it's great on other people's jobs. I'm in it because I like building stuff. I don't want to see pre-manufactured components, and that's a selfish attitude, but it's the truth. And I think I'm not alone in that.
Well,
I think it really depends on what it is. We've definitely done, we've done a tectonics house from Benson Wood where we've gotten the walls, the sheathing, the windows, everything's already in it. But it took us 2 weeks to stand those walls because it had to be perfect on the foundation that was 1.5 inches out when we got it, which was not good. And so there are a lot of parts and pieces that come in, but also talking to the Benson Wood crew, the more they do in the factory, the more they can push costs down. And they can't push costs down if they're only giving you a small part of the component, because it's expensive to have the overhead of the whole factory to do it too. So there's a push and pull in how much you have to get in order to make it cost effective, which would make other people buy into it. Yeah. And then there's the backwards front that if it's too much all at once, then how it goes together and how it fits together. And there have been a lot of comments in the chat about SIPs and their failure points where those systems go together, so that like it's not a simple and streamlined, easy solution. Or, modular construction going down the road has certain parameters. And even when they get it to you, if the road was a little rough, like, hey, we live in New England, we got a ton of potholes, it gets to you, things are cracked. And, well, so when you get it, you're patching things, but you're sort of wondering like, okay, I don't know, what else am I missing here? I'm going to patch this, but and it's only as good as the person who sealed the marriage wall together, or you've got an outside wall in the middle of your structure. So there's definitely pros and cons to it. Yeah, I don't know that they've solved it yet, but micro zero waste factories that are smaller, that have less overhead, that could be, saving I don't know. I don't know what the answer is.
I think there's a lot of solutions solved, but the term is so vast. So offsite construction encompasses so much. And in areas where you have a plethora of stick framers, you probably want to keep the stick framers doing what they do, because they boogie, right? They just get it done and it's amazing. If you're doing a replicatable scale development, then that is a perfect fit for a panelized or prefab or modular, depending on the quality you need. Because we've seen modular people make, these gorgeous one-offs and no price is spared. But then we've seen other plants trying to break into the affordable because they're trying to pass on the savings and quality of the new modular that exists. So we're up at it, our backs against the wall again. There's no silver bullet because we're trying to hit a lot of barns.
Yeah, those are really good points, Mark. it seems like modular construction in general makes so much more sense on a larger scale. Like you talked about the repeatability of it, but in terms of residential construction, it always strikes me that the cost savings and efficiencies are touted, but I've yet to come across a residential project that's more cost effective than a double stud wall construction. Like I never see that. I don't know if it happens or not, but anyway, those are great points you make.
I've been exploring it for my job pretty heavily recently, and it's really a response to the fact that good framers are getting harder and harder to find. There are framing crews, but for the product I'm trying to deliver, the framing crews that I have available to me for the most part are not up to the level that I need. The framing crews that I do have are aging. So we're looking at, ways to do offsite. One of the other options we've explored, the same group that I was talking about, that is the middleman for panelization. What they can do is they can create essentially shop drawings where we could rent a commercial space. They'll generate shop drawings and we can then hand them to our framers and put them in that commercial space in heated and cooled, well-lit area. So they're not in the weather, they're in, better working conditions, and allow them to panelize at a small scale local to the project. It's just a way that we're going to be able to make their working career better. I don't know if we're going to save money at it, but we're really just trying to find a way that we can deliver a good quality product at the end of the day. So, and it's not, and Kylie's absolutely right. I can't, cost-wise, I can't compete to what stick framers do in the field, but what I can do is I can remove a level of liability and risk out of the equation by having something delivered and up in a week or two versus 3 or 4 months.
And I find that interesting.
Repeatability, Ben, it makes perfect sense. It just does. And I think we have so many existing warehouses that could accommodate this coming in and out. I mean, when we used to make windows and trim packages for homes, we made them right there on the block we were working at, right? And it was move here and move there and move there and move there. That's how our building stock happened. So I think that square peg has to find the right round hole.
I think it kind of goes back to something you alluded to earlier, Mark, though, when you talked about how people come into the trades. Very few of us say, I want to do this. People fall into working in the building trades. And when you have components, modular construction, and I've worked on a lot of modular homes 30 years ago as a subcontractor. Hopefully they've improved since then. But you're depending on so many different systems working together that are not necessarily talking to each other, as Alexandra alluded to. You get the excavation contractor, you get the foundation contractor, you've got to get that in there perfect. I've seen foundations built 8 inches too small and they still set the modular on it and let it overhang. That's not what I'd call good construction. So people need to talk to each other. The systems need to align, and hopefully we get good enough at communication to make that sort of thing happen. And I think it can be a great thing, particularly in larger projects, multifamily. It makes a ton of sense.
I think you bring up a really good point when you just talk about the idea of everybody being on the same page, because when we all sit here and talk about building better and building science, when we go and do that out on our projects, it's like a quarter of a way there if I want to build a better wall. So it's that perfect storm of making sure the framer's on board, the builder's on board, the client is on board, because for them to get halfway through and then decide like, oh, you know what, we don't want to use that insulation, or we don't want to do this, or we don't want to do that. There's no way that we can really build these building science and these perfect walls and all of this stuff if not everybody's on the same page. And I think that's one of the things that we make sure when we start projects is to sit there, and that's part of the collaboration effort too, of just bringing everybody on board with the clients at the first couple meetings and just saying, okay, are we headed in the right direction in terms of, do we all want to do this? Because if we don't, maybe we need to talk about a different architect. Maybe we have to talk about a different builder, depending on what we want to do. Because it's not just, does the client think that we are the right fit for them, but is the client the right fit for us? And I think it goes both ways, and it goes both ways for the builder, and it goes both ways for the installator. And as long as everybody's on the same page, then we can head in the direction that we're all trying to head in.
It's really interesting because if you take a plan set to a panelized or prefab place, they're like, well, that has to be redrawn, right off the bat. But oftentimes as contractors and architects, we don't sit right away with the client and say, oh, that's never going to work. And so that backbone of the right team for the right project and the right client for the right project is such, it just echoes the need for the collaboration of and all that inclusivity, like Ben brought up, of do we go to offsite, do we stick build, like Andy said, like we each have our strong suits. What is the project calling for? What is the products involved need? What do the people need? And then what do the professionals need to come together on? It's a four-legged chair. And, we all love rocking chairs, but that four-legged chair is those principles together.
Yeah.
Ben, every time I've spoken with architects and mostly architects when it comes to this subject, I get the impression that oftentimes they will say along the lines of like, you need skilled labor to work with modular construction, and it's just better to go with stick framing because you don't need specialized construction techniques or crews that understand those techniques. But it sounds like you're saying the opposite of that. And I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
I think the level or the number of knowledgeable people I need on a site to pull off a good quality panelized job is less than I need to pull off a well-executed stick frame job.
Okay.
Realistically, if I have one or two people that really understand how that panelized package goes together on the site, we can probably make it happen with some low-skilled labor force. Whereas when we get into framing large custom houses, that framing crew, even the low-skilled guy on that framing crew, has to be pretty knowledgeable. So.
Okay.
In this same vein, how does everybody feel about CLT coming into our industry? Does it work for residential? Is it a larger scale thing? Thoughts?
So most of the plants, the few that we have been are operating still on two shift that I'm aware of. And CLT is just one of the flavors, right? For some reason, it got it's like net zero. It got that wingspan where people just take off with CLT. I think if we harness the third shift of those plants and the diverse other products in the mass timber category, it will happen. We have an interesting time period of fiber, right? It was the perfect storm of everyone talking about carbon and carbon sequestration and the wood movement and all this mass timber, and then all of a sudden we're at the fiber prices and that. So it'll be a little bit of a shakeout period, but I think it's, regardless of that cost, it's still going to be there. It's in the code books from way back when under heavy timber. Mass timber is again, I don't want to misspeak this, but it's kind of a marketing term today. Heavy timber is what all our industrial buildings were built out of. And, our steel production wasn't there. Our wood production was, and those buildings are still here today. Many times they have concrete floors put over the top of them for their transformation. But they're specimens, and the technology of computers and the collaborative work to make the digital twins, I think, will make the timber plants abound. But we need to make those mass timber products the way Europe does. In the U.S., we don't make them that way. We mill lumber and then we separate it for mass timber. In Europe, they actually mill the lumber for the mass timber. so they get 25% more use out of their trees.
There's something, Mark, to the, or anyone who knows, is there something to the vastness of our great nation that makes these larger items less palatable? The distance from the plant is always an issue or the distance from the modular, whatever. The distance from the forest when you're in the Arizona desert, I think makes a difference. All those things matter, right? So if we're talking about selling CLT, and one of the great benefits of that is you have this nice fire resistant, enormous, beautiful floor that is also your finished ceiling below it. That's fantastic. Can we put it on a truck and get it to me, or put it on a train and then a truck, or 2 barges and then a train and then a truck? How many of these items are held back just by virtue of the fact that our nation's enormous and spread out?
So if you break that down to what you said and just bring that to mass timber, not CLT, right? I believe just like truss manufacturers, they're roughly a 200 or 150 mile radius around a truss manufacturer. That's what they service. And then the next truss manufacturer picks up that work because you have these long lengths and you have that skilled force. They put it together and they have all they could do to keep up with business. They have all the work they need. Now, if you take the NLT, right? Tomorrow, you could get a couple units of lumber sent to Ben, to Andy, to Emily, to Kylie, to Alexandra, to Travis, and you guys can make the NLT right there on site or right in your garage and truck out pieces and then fit them together. So you don't need a factory to produce that. You can produce it yourself. Be a little bit harder to do the dowel, but you could. You would need your structural engineer involved in that aspect. But where I mentioned at the beginning, to come full circle on that, Travis, with when we brought in these laminated beams and you would call up your lumberyard and you'd say, I need 4 at 20 and I need 6 at 12. I truly believe those CLTs will be brought in to certain, it's a controlled market, right? So certain lumber centers, and they will have the tooling to cut up those panels, and then we'll have panelized ready for that. It's a scale thing. I hope it comes from the industry for the industry. I really hate to see a Google, Facebook CLT factory, but that's because I was brought up with boots.
There was a comment in there about how we need kind of like CLT light for residential construction, because even the standard, what are they, the 5 1/4 inch CLT panels, the small ones are generally too much. And I became aware recently of mass plywood, which is a basically CLT light, which might be a good fit as it comes into the country for residential constructions. It's essentially like 1.5 inch or 2 inch CLT panel, where we can now do larger spans of wall and floor systems using less labor because we're covering more square footage per day type of situation. So to me, it's an interesting area. I don't think we're there for in the residential market yet, aside from, very boutique niche little projects for the high end. But
I would say, Ben, there are 3 companies in North America working on that. You won't find them in a Google search, but they're good people. And what they need is the repeatability. We used to create cars, and you would pick your color, and you would pick whether you have automated windows and all these sort of things. And then they decided to put a bunch of pre-done cars on the lot, and you pick them. Mm-hmm. So in a way, the way to scale with all these systems is to have some more repeatability. And if we're looking for a source of what that repeatability is, we just look in our past, and it's called Sears Roebuck Catalog. They produced repeatability, and it allowed people to create the DIY and finish their houses. They had the shell. Now, code doesn't really allow that today, but code changes. But it allowed its sweat equity to happen. And I think our country has proven during pandemic that all generations are capable of DIY, regardless of whether they watch a funky television show about moving a bus.
So I kind of wanted to take a little bit of a turn here and just address the hardware aspect too, because we've talked about the wood members themselves in terms of framing. Obviously, we haven't really touched on metal as part of framing, but that has an element. Obviously, commercial is almost entirely metal structures. Metal on giant I-beams for every one of those boxes. So we haven't really talked about that. That's not anything that I think this panel is super passionate about or expert in. So I feel a little bit okay glossing over that. But I did think it would be interesting to mention the hardware advancements that we've seen in terms of we talked about advanced framing for just a second, being able to eliminate thermal bridging by eliminating wood in the walls with a header hanger instead of having extra jacks and things like that. Particularly the advancements in like lag screw technology and even some of the really fancy fasteners for holding deck ledgers on and things like that I think have made a difference for our industry. I think they're worth a mention. And if anyone wants to go off on that tangent, by all means. But the other direction I was kind of hoping we could go to is, because it's a building science show, and we've seen historically when we make an advancement, we usually have a tremendous disaster to fix from what we learned after making that advancement. I kind of want to know what we should be watching out for as we see these things. Like, do I need to be worried about different things with, let's say that mass plywood becomes a thing? Do I have to worry about delamination? Do we have to do sealing of cuts on ingrain? Like, I have all these questions.
So framing, when it was standardized, it went for the 2x4 to 16 on center. For some reason, when we moved to the 2x6, people wanted to do it 16-inch on center. Really baffles your mind. It makes no sense. So then you move to the 24-inch on center, and you ask Travis, what's the disaster in these advancements? So you're told to build a wall 24 inches on center, boom, wall's done, right? Then you or someone else comes along and they're told to put this type of sheathing and this type of, let's say, insulation on it. Boom, that's put on, done. Now someone else comes along and they're told to put on this siding, right? Well, where are the fasteners for that siding that are required to be embedded into the stud? And you could call up XYZ company, no reason to name names, and they're going to say, yes, you have to have this gap and you have to connect it to the stud. Well, wall's built, siding's there, all this is there. Those fasteners exist. They're certainly not local. And I guarantee you that siding contractor never had intended on running into all those problems, right? And quite possibly, maybe he can't. Maybe the nailing configuration calls for closer studs. It's right. We've been there, and so that's the collaboration of the manufacturer, the architect, and the contractors to pull it all together. One person just can't come up with an idea and think that everyone down the line isn't affected, because when you push that domino, you tend to create a rally.
But to some degree, Mark, that it falls on the responsibility of the builder or the installer to be doing their due diligence to understand the product they're installing. I'll throw names out here. LP Smart Side, if you read through their specifications, they have a very specific nail that they call out. A couple of years ago, when I was working with Dan up in Maine, I called, our lumberyard. We were installing LP. I said, I need the 0.113 with the 0.27 nail, head nail, yada, yada, yada. He said, what are those for? I said, well, those are the LP nails. He looked at me, he said, we've been selling this stuff for years and nobody's ever ordered those nails.
Yeah.
Literally never once. And I understand what you're getting at there, but that really, to me, that's not a viable excuse, because that falls, and it's tough because it's, as builders now, we have that much more.
Excuse. I'm not saying it's an excuse, Ben, but if you have loads of siding going to an area and you don't have loads of nails going to that area, the manufacturer also is involved in that equation, as is the dealer, right?
Well, in my example there, exactly, that lumber yard should have
That's
been
why I call
stocking
it the
that, and it
railing.
should have been on the shelf.
Right.
Yeah, understood.
We have, so in Chicago, we have many building supply places that have 1/2 inch material, and many of our code requires 5/8. Their answer, Ben, is people use 1/2 inch because no one checks.
Mhm.
So the manufacturer's making it, the supplier selling it, the contractor's using it. I mean, 1/2 inch 5/8, is it a big deal? Well, that's not mine to judge. I didn't make the code. It's my duty to meet or exceed that.
One of the things that I figured out after, I don't know, 15 or 20 years as an editor at Fine Home Building and other magazines, is that editors wouldn't be necessary if people actually read the instructions that came with the products they bought. That's the only reason shelter magazines exist.
Well, I hope that's not true.
Oh, don't worry. No one's going to read the instructions, Kylie. You're safe.
It's a lot of pressure, Andy.
With those advancements, those instructions and that trainings from all the entities is necessary. The architect does rely on that feedback from the manufacturer, and the manufacturer relies on that insight from the architect. Because oftentimes we see materials and they wonder why it doesn't move. It's because none of us know how the heck to use it, right? And we need that education. I always go back to that connectionness. It's the people, it's the product, it's the projects. They have to come together sooner than later. Again and again. That's just the foundation for success.
No, I agree. And like on our projects, when we, for example, when we're getting ready to put our windows in, we make sure that we are there. We make sure that the installer from the window company is there. We make sure the builder is there, and everybody's there to put in the first window together so that everybody says their piece. We're all on the same page. And then all the rest of the windows go in with ease with zero questions because we already solved everything that one day. And then the rest of the days, they all go in. So everybody's on board. So when it leaks or something, there's no question on, where the installer says like, well, did you put it in right? Did you read the manual? Well, you were here. We all decided this was right. So now we have to all go back and understand what the real issue is because we all thought that this was put in correctly.
To push back a little bit on that, Lexi, I totally get where you're coming from here. But ultimately, in my position, I'm the builder on the project. I'm the one that has to own the liability on it. And all of us here well know that most of these manufacturers have a team of lawyers that's going to find some way to throw me under the bus in the event that there's a problem. So it's not uncommon, and I'm not advocating anybody else does this, but it's not uncommon for me to completely ignore the manufacturer's recommendations and go with what I believe is going to work correctly. But I take your point 100%. That's an excellent way to approach it. But at the end of the day, it's my ass that's going to be in that jury bench or, in front of that judge to answer for what went wrong.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely, I understand what you're saying and I agree, but I guess more of our point of it is it's less like it is there for liability purposes in terms of just saying that they were there. So in case something came back, but I do hear that, yeah, they're coming right after you, but it's also an education purpose in terms of let me understand how you think, because how I think that window goes in is completely different than the builder's going to look at me and say, well, no, this is actually an easier way from the last 20 years of me putting in windows. This is how I'm going to do it now. And then I start to understand like, oh, I would have never thought of that because I'm sitting here drawing it rather than putting it together. So, but I totally hear what you're saying in terms of the liability.
I would echo that point too, Ben. When you're there and you're reviewing it with whoever the supplier is, whomever your architectural team is, and then running it by your client and say, this is what they all said. These are the steps I'm taking. It's on me. But that's still collaboration, right? Mm-hmm. It's just the fact that you're coming forward, Ben, and owning it. That's not to say that our entire industry owns it, right? Sometimes we do it our way because it's our way, but that doesn't mean that we're owning it. It just means we're punched out at 5.
I just prefer to conscientiously go into knowing the risk that I'm dealing with versus just turning a blind eye to it.
Sure.
So I'm going to jump in here because we're getting close to the end of the show. And I'd like everybody to weigh in on their favorite types of framing, whether it's advanced or taking us out. Now, I know Andy said he likes to stick build, but how do you stick build? What's the best way to do it? Are you in support of, balloon framing, but with CLT or something crazy? And Mark might be skewed with Tstud, but we haven't talked a lot about them tonight. Right. So, or Larsen trusses or some of the other kind of not structural parts of how we are doing super thick framed wall sections in the Northeast and colder climates. So
there's always a part two, Emily.
Well, Mark, our podcast is going to be 2 parts because it's too long, but you can tune into that and hear Mark's world on the podcast next week. But yeah, I just wanted to pull it back to, we talk about investments in framing. So what's that there? And on my screen, Andy, you're at the top, so you get to go first.
In my remodeling world, one of the regular things that I see on the architect's plans says match existing.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of limited in what I can do most times. That's the world I'm in. If I were building a new home for myself, I would hire Ben as a consultant and figure out how to do probably a double stud wall with bales and bales of cellulose. But the reality is my world is very limited. And if I was doing it just for fun, I would timber frame it. I love timber framing. There's nothing more fun than timber framing. But it's not exactly what you would call cost effective.
So when it says match existing, Andy, are you out hewing hemlock floors and?
Probably. Absolutely. That's my impression of Andy. He would want to.
If so, I'll be over and I'll grab my chain hoist.
Well, okay, I'll take some liberties. I'm going to use mineral wool and not fiberglass because one you can do a good job with and the other you can't. That sort of thing. But for the most part, and I would have those conversations with the architect too. Again, back to Lexi's point about collaboration. The projects that I'm working on, one I'm with on right now, we have a great architect and we speak several times a week. And it really makes everybody's job easier.
Yeah, for sure. I am. Most people know I do a lot of double stud walls, but right now double stud wall is not the cheapest way to do things. I mean, it is still for some people, but lumber prices are high. So we've been evaluating it. And so yesterday I had the structural engineer, myself, and the builder on the phone discussing all of our shear panels so that we could make sure that if we changed something that we could have the same performance of the wall system, which everybody was on board with, including the client, which was fabulous, but also that we're not going to create an issue by swapping something out, doing 2x8s with zip R6. Well, zip R6 doesn't have the same shear. What's our nailing pattern? What do we need? Do we need metal straps? How's this attached together? Do we need plates? And, and so it was very good that all of us were talking to each other about how to change those framing things. So, Mark, you're next up on my screen, so you get to jump in.
Got it. My favorite walls to build, my bias would actually be working on existing homes. But in the world of non-existing homes, it's always based off of a planned wall. So I don't care what the wall is, as long as it's planned. I like all the decisions to be flushed so that the client knows what they're getting. I know when and where I could get the materials from the manufacturer. The architect and I have pulled our hair out and put it back in and worked it together. I like the added time so that once we start, we could run and we could enjoy it. So in terms of materials, I like thermal breaks, right? Wink, wink. I do like the benefits of mineral wool. I really enjoy what cellulose does. And then above all, I like a wall that controls the water and has air tightness. So after that, if you happen to be a gypsum or you happen to be a this cladding person, all good. But for me, I want I want the inside of the wall to be something that I love and labor for, and I want it to be there for 150 plus years. Otherwise, I'm doing a disservice to my craft.
All right. So that leaves you, Lexi.
So, I'm going back and forth in my seat as they answer the questions, but it's kind of a hard question because a lot of it has everything to do with the client and everything to do with, there are a lot of projects that like, I think something's a great wall, but it is clearly not even close to the right budget, to the right fit, to what we want it to do. But I mean, if I had to pull myself back and put myself in a perfect world where I think we're headed, and I really like the idea of the T-stud, what we're doing in Missouri, where we put the half-block wool in it. It's working really well, and putting the insulated sheathing on the outside of that with a rain screen. It's just, so far, we're not seeing any problems with it. And I think we're all on board thinking that it's a really great wall so far.
How long has the T-stud been in existence? I should know the answer to this because I've written about it and interviewed people about it, but you say, huh?
1670 in the back streets of London first came about. It danced around in certain job sites ever since, but no one ever made it. I say that, Kylie, because everyone that I talk to about the product, they all say, I thought of that, and I can't believe it's never been here. So in all reality, it was invented 8 years ago by Brian Iverson. And just like WD-40, there was many reiterations before it got involved to kind of where you see it today. And I joined the company when they started producing the bare naked version. So
I'm just so curious to see its unfolding, and what 8 years is not a lot of hindsight, so it'll just be really interesting to keep an eye on that product. And
there's some similar things in Europe, but there's quite a bit of patents here that are done, and I'm fortunate. I get to see the strategic vision of where the company's going, and we got to go visit Travis and Jake and Alexandra and Steven and Missouri, and show some things that the public can't see. So it's fun, and the T is all about thermal break. So you guys know me. I don't come on to give commercials, but I do stand behind brands that I love and brands that my friends love, and I understand thermal effectiveness because I've watched cats and dogs my whole life, and they understand where comfortable spots are in buildings, and it's about time humans start learning from those pets.
So Travis, you didn't get to weigh in yet. I mean, we talked some more Northeast style here. What's your favorite? What are you excited about coming in advancements?
Well, I am still very much like some of our panel, enthusiastic about actually putting my hands on the material, shaping things into other things is kind of the joy of the craft. So I very much am a stick frame guy. And honestly, I haven't had a chance to work with T-stud yet. So maybe I am a T-stud guy and I just don't know it yet. But I've worked with a lot of other engineered woods, and a large home in the woods that we're building now is all I-joist roof. I've done a lot of trussed floor systems. We've done truss roofs before. So I'm not averse to the advancements. I actually really like an I-joist roof, especially for low slope. There's something to working with straight stuff that you don't have to fight too hard. I'm a big fan of that. And having long lengths means less time, less joints, less bracing. Everything is big and fast. And that makes it kind of fun, because that's the big win is the end of the day when you stand back and see what you did, or you drive your kids by on a Saturday to check the job / show off. Like, this is what we did this week. So I'm very much still I want my hands on the stuff. I want to be able to pick it up and move it over and secure it. So that makes it hard for me to want to adopt panelized stuff. I am really intrigued at the idea of some of the mass timber elements. Obviously, timber framing is, to me, that's art. That's just, it's so beautiful to see the tenons slide into the mortises and all the beauty of the grain. That's artistry. And so if I ever got the chance to do that, I would do that. But for now, my version of that's like, oh, I'm going to let in this 6x6 cedar to make up this post on my deck connection. So I'm a little lower level than that, but that's definitely my preferred methods. We use a lot of 2x6 on 24-inch centers. We minimize our thermal bridging as much as we can with that method. And I'm excited to get better at my craft every day. And it sounds like there's a lot of opportunities to do that. So I'm grateful for that.
Travis, do
And
you
like-
do a lot of double stud walls there?
We don't do any double stud walls.
I guess
here.
you don't need, yeah, your climate's different, right?
And
Yeah.
also cellulose is really not something that happens a lot around here. My
Right.
installation contractors all charge more for it than fiber. And the settling issues in attics really gave it a bad name around here a long time ago. I
Mhm.
blew it into walls in a balloon framed house. I was one of the guys that blew it in from the attic and then went down into the crawl space real quick to make sure everything was still okay. And it was. I lucked out on that one. Enough of the plaster keys had broken off to fill those cavities years ago. So, I was fortunate in that regard. But the double stud thing, just, it's not a thing here. It's
Yeah.
not. I see the benefit of it. We've talked before about this. I'm not in any way saying it's a bad idea. It's just not a thing here.
Right.
Yeah, well, for your market, and I think this was clear too when we did the wall system competition, is we can't just talk about the Northeast. Like double stud wall may never make sense in your market. It might not.
Mhm.
So, but then I'm going to turn it over to Ben and say, what job are you taking your kid by to show off, and what's its wall system?
So I have kind of two approaches here, and my first answer is very similar to what Mark's is. I want whatever wall system is meeting the client's needs, the architect's directives, and our abilities for the project at hand. I'm pretty agnostic to what it is, as long as it's done well. If it was my house, I'd probably call my friend Brad Morse up in Massachusetts, a timber framer, and turn him loose. And then maybe skin the outside of it with CLT and a bunch of exterior insulation. You know, money is no object if I win the lotto. So yeah, that's kind of where I sit. But you know, run of the mill kind of standard construction, it's hard for me to beat a double stud wall in the Northeast.
Lexi?
Oh, no, I mean, I agree with everything that you guys are saying. And I just think that climate, I didn't bring that up, but I think that's a very good point in terms of what Emily was saying. Something like a T-stud up here, that double set, the Larsen truss, like getting that thermal break in New England is something that's amazing, fantastic. Like I can feel the difference inside very clearly. But if you bring that over to like California or something, like why would you pay a price for something that isn't giving the benefit that it is here? Here, I'll pay the extra money if I'm gonna feel the difference. And I think that's the way that we mostly sell it to our clients of, listen, you're going to be able to feel it. Like when I stand next to the walls and the windows, like I don't feel colder. It feels the same conditioned space all throughout the inside. In California, when I have my windows open, 90% of the time, I think it's a very different story to ask somebody to pay that money for something that doesn't benefit nearly to the percent that it does here.
True. I think that's
So
a solid
true.
around the horn. Does anyone have anything else that's just eating at them? They've got to get off their chest before we wrap this thing up. We're kind of up at the end of it. Oh,
I'm hoping that you guys have 24-hour shows, because maybe at the 24-hour mark we would create the silver bullet wall and the silver bullet offsite and the silver bullet mechanical. So at 23 hours, you're not quite going to get there, but I believe at 24, it's plausible. So maybe in September at the KC symposium, it turns into a 24-hour picnic. I'm not sure, but I'll bring a sleeping bag just in case.
How are we doing on coffee sponsorship, Travis?
we can make that happen. I know some people. We'll get it together.
I was gonna say, it sounds like it's turning into summer camp. You go to the symposium, but you have to stay up all night, like those all-nighters back when, maybe I only did this when I was in high school, but we stayed up all night and you raised money for something or whatever. It's gonna be like an up all night to come up with the perfect system.
You
that
mean
can
like
be-
till 10 o'clock or so?
Yeah, right.
Turn into a
Hey, Andy.
pumpkin at 9:30. What are you talking about?
I tell you, the crew that ends the night is not the crew in charge of breakfast. That just doesn't work. That's something I figured out.
They're the first in line, though.
Always.
Thank
Well,
you
on
for
that note,
having
I think-
us.
No, thank you, everybody. I appreciate
Great
Yeah,
it.
it was a
conversation.
pleasure.
Excellent show, most enlightening. Thanks to everyone who joined us tonight, obviously our panel and of course our audience. We'll see you next week. Thanks so much.
Good night, all.
Good night.